To successfully complete your senior thesis, I have a list of suggestions of things that you should and should not do over the course of the next several months. To begin, write well. We're going to grade you on the basis of what you say, not what you mean. Here's an actual example from a thesis that was written about 10 years ago. The student said, continued economic growth, manufactured by temporal stimuli, concludes that the maximization of investment, attraction of further investment, and continued economic expansion have a significant effect on overall GDP growth. This paragraph, no doubt to the student, sounded quite intelligent. However, when we evaluate your thesis, we will evaluate it on the basis of what you have actually said, not how it sounds. So let's take a look at this paragraph. The student uses the word manufacture. Manufacture means to form into a material or a product. Manufacture is a verb, economic growth is the noun. Economic growth doesn't form things into products. A better word here is create, to cause, to exist, or to bring into being. The student also uses the word conclude. Conclude means to reach a decision or to form an opinion. Conclude refers back to economic growth, but economic growth has no mind. It cannot reach a decision or form an opinion. A better word here is imply, to involve by logical necessity. So the corrected paragraph now reads, continued economic growth created by temporal stimuli implies that the maximization of investment, attraction of further investment, and continued economic expansion have a significant effect on overall GDP growth. The term maximization means to make as large as possible. The word further means additional. If we have maximized investment, then it's impossible to attract further investment because the investment is already as large as it can possibly be. So this phrase is self-contradictory and has no meaning. Continued economic growth created by temporal stimuli implies that continued economic expansion has a significant effect on overall GDP growth. Temporal means limited by time. All stimuli are temporal, so this word is redundant and can be removed. The phrase created by stimuli refers back to economic growth, but all economic growth is created by stimuli, so this phrase is also redundant and can be removed. Our paragraph now reads, continued economic growth implies that continued economic expansion has a significant effect on overall GDP growth. There is no difference between overall GDP growth and GDP growth. There is no difference between significant effect and effect, unless you mean it in the statistical sense. So these two words can be removed. Our paragraph now reads, continued economic growth implies that continued economic expansion has an effect on GDP growth. Economic growth means the growth in the production of goods and services. Economic expansion is the growth in the production of goods and services. GDP growth is the growth in the production of goods and services. These three terms all mean the same thing. So our paragraph reads, continued GDP growth implies that continued GDP growth has an effect on GDP growth. So this is what the student thought he said, and this is what the student actually said. As you write your thesis, be extremely careful that you don't become enamored with how the thing sounds. We don't care how it sounds, we care what you say. 2. Write concisely. Davies showed that different cultures may view smoking differently, and if some ethnicities are more accepting of smoking, then that acceptance will be reflected in a higher rate of smoking for that ethnicity. Unlike the GDP growth paragraph, this paragraph actually does communicate something meaningful. However, the student has written this using 33 words. A lot of these words can be deleted without losing the ideas that the words encompass. For example, in 15 words, the student could have said, Davies showed that ethnicities that are more accepting of smoking will experience higher smoking rates. Or better still, in 8 words, Davies showed that smoking rates vary by ethnicity. As you write, remember that the words are tools whose purpose it is to convey ideas. Your goal is to communicate as many ideas as you can in as few words as possible. 3. Conduct a thorough literature review. There are 2 purposes to a literature review. One is to convince the reader that you have looked at the material that came before you and is relevant to your research. The second is to show how your work fits in with the previous work. Imagine that there is this chain of thought that extends back through the years. Each article is a link in the chain. You are doing 2 things in writing your thesis. One is you are forming this new link. The second is that you are attaching the link to the chain of thought that came before it. One of the purposes of the literature review is to show how your link fits into the links that came before. In conducting literature reviews, perhaps a third of the students will show up at some point and say, I can't find any articles on my topic. If you can't find any articles on your topic, one of two things is true. Either you have stumbled across a Nobel quality topic, or you simply haven't looked hard enough. A good place to begin your literature review is Google Scholar. When you find articles that you believe are relevant to your research, if you can't get them directly through Google Scholar, then you can likely access them through JSTOR. So what is an adequate literature review? Here's an example of an inadequate review. Loizides and Vamvoukas find countries' national incomes are positively correlated with the sizes of their private sectors. All this literature review tells me is that at some point you stumbled upon an article written by these two people and you managed to read the title. A proper literature review will answer the following questions. What data did the authors examine? What did they hypothesize? What did they find? What is odd or interesting about their findings? And finally, who cares? The answer to who cares tells me how this particular article fits into the links in the chain that came before it and possibly fits the links that come after. 4. Ditch your job, your fraternity, and your significant other. Nothing you do over the next 3 months is going to be as important as this senior thesis, not just for the purpose of this semester, but moving forward. When you apply for graduate school, when you apply for a job, you'll be able to put this thesis on the desk and show that you are capable of conducting meaningful and original research. 5. Select a topic you find interesting. You're going to live with this topic for the next 3 months. It needs to be something that you're interested in getting up and doing day after day. 6. Start work immediately. If you haven't started already, you're behind. 7. Consult with faculty who published in your area. You do not want to get up at your senior thesis and only then discover for the first time that there's someone in the audience who has an expertise in your topic. 8. Apply sanity checks. When you're done with your complex econometrics and mathematical modeling, it matters very much that whatever result you hold out makes intuitive sense. If you present results that have no clear intuitive meaning, all this tells the audience is that you're capable of pushing buttons on a computer and watching numbers come out, but that you do not understand what they mean. So those are things that you should do. Now for the list of things you should not do. Do not cite websites or popular press publications. Do not use animation, sound, or frills in your slides, and do not employ fluff. These last two items are signals to us that you don't know what you're doing and that you're trying to hide it amongst a flurry of sights and sounds and verbiage. Common manifestations of fluff in your writing. Vague references, like several factors contribute. If you can't quickly name 3 factors, it's fluff. If you can name the 3 factors, then name them. Words chosen for their sound. Temporal, macroeconomic, and financial stimuli. If you can't clearly define what the phrase means, the phrase is fluff. Useless sentences. Over time, the Brazilian economy moves inexorably toward the future. If duh is an appropriate response, it's fluff. Useless modifiers. National economic conditions invariably change. If you can remove modifiers without altering the idea, it's fluff. Gratuitous quotes. Friedman finds that, quote, the velocity of money is relatively constant. If it isn't necessary to preserve the author's exact words, the quote is fluff. Paraphrase the author instead. When you arrive at your senior thesis defense, we expect you to be the expert in the room on your topic. As an expert, there are several things you should never say. I couldn't find the data. It's your job to find the data, or to show that the data doesn't exist and devise a creative way around the lack of data. I couldn't find a solution. It's your job to find a solution, or to prove that the solution does not exist. I didn't have time. As of 5 p.m. today, you have 2,392 hours. Lastly, this thesis is not pro forma. People don't automatically pass. A B+ grade is a very good thesis. An A- is an excellent thesis. A grades we tend to reserve for journal quality theses. And in fact, many of our students have subsequently published their theses in academic journals. It's not common for economics undergraduates to write senior theses, and it is extremely uncommon for all students to be required to write theses. With the senior thesis, you make a transition from being a student to being a scholar. This is something that very few economics undergraduates achieve. To be sitting here now means that each one of you has already demonstrated that you have the skills necessary to complete this work. All that's left is to determine whether you have the drive. Good luck.